Bad behaviour in classrooms seems to be a never-ending problem.
Increasing violence in Northland schools has principals fearing for the safety of staff and pupils. Children as young as 5 are reportedly hitting, biting and swearing at teachers.
One teacher told the survey they have been physically assaulted by students 3 times in the 3 years they have been a teacher.
And there's more stories in the numerous reports. A teacher in Christchurch was attacked with scissors, another student struck 2 teachers in Auckland, and in Tauranga, a student lashed out at a teacher after being told to put away their phone. So how do we fix it? Well, ACT has a solution.
Wanting to give teachers stronger powers to remove disruptive kids from class and in some cases, fine their parents.
I mean, let's be honest. There are a lot of little shits in classrooms, and we need to address that if we're going to lift education standards.
But teachers don't like it.
I'm really struggling with this policy. It's a stupid policy designed by people who I don't think have spoken to a teacher at all about any of this.
Kia ora, I'm Shalise Tansey, and today on The Detail, yet another report highlights the struggles teachers face when it comes to bad behaviour in classrooms, but what's being done about it. Later on, I talked to the Post-Primary Teachers Association about the concerns teachers have with ACT's solution to the issue. But first, RNZ's education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
The Council for Educational Research has been surveying secondary teachers and principals and also primary teachers and principals regularly for quite a few years now. And one of the things they track is teachers' experience of student behaviour. And the most recent report, which was based on survey responses in late 2025, early 2026, found that there has been quite an increase in teachers reporting bad behaviour. So the question was, was your teaching sometimes or often seriously disrupted by student behaviour? And the response for this 2025 survey was 67% of respondents said their teaching had been sometimes or often seriously disrupted by bad student behaviour. Now that's up quite a lot from 2021 when the figure was 61%. But if you go back to 2015, 2018, it was only around half of teachers said that they were experiencing that sort of disruption. And there was a few comments from teachers about the sort of things they were seeing. And one of them was a new teacher who said, look, I've only been teaching for 3 years. I've been assaulted 3 times by students physically, breaking up physical fights. So they were quite shocked by what they were experiencing. And if you look also at primary teachers, now, in 2024, the Council for Educational Research published a survey of primary teachers, and it found that the percentage in that sector reporting disruption by bad student behaviour sometimes or often had jumped from 68% in 2019 to 82% in 2024. So it's rising across the board.
Now, that is astronomical to me that we have teachers reporting of being assaulted 3 times in 3 years. But these figures rising, are we really that surprised by this?
There has been sort of multiple warning signs about this. And a lot of people have been saying that they are seeing worse behaviour post-COVID, that kids who experienced lockdown, whose schooling was disrupted by lockdown, struggled when they came to school, particularly those perhaps who'd missed out at an intermediate level and that sort of thing. So there has been some sort of expectation that was going to flow through the system. There is an international study also that the OECD runs called PISA that studies 15-year-olds' progress in reading, maths and science, and they also look at behaviour. And they did a report back in 2023.
An OECD survey shows Kiwi 15-year-olds are more likely to say their classes are disrupted by bad behaviour and distractions than teens in any other of the 37 developed nations.
Either New Zealand has some of the worst behaved classrooms in the entire world, or Kiwi kids are just more likely to call out bad behaviour and say they're experiencing bad behaviour. So we're not quite sure which, but certainly on the basis of those results, it would appear that New Zealand classrooms are worse behaved than those in many of the countries we'd compare ourselves with, so Australia, Canada, the UK. And it also actually, one of the interesting things here is it sort of quantified how much impact this bad behaviour can be. And PISA testing found that the students who were in classrooms that they said were pretty well behaved scored by the equivalent of 2 years of learning better than the students who said they're in the worst behaved classroom. So there is a really big impact on student learning from poor behaviour. And it's quite interesting, the government's really trying to improve students' results and so forth, get more people getting qualifications, reading, writing and so forth. But it does look like, actually, if you just improve behaviour in classrooms, you could get a long way towards achieving those improvements.
In 2024, the Education Review Office also came out with a report that wasn't much better than the PISA survey of the previous year.
21% of teachers deal with students physically harming each other every day. That includes extreme violence. 32% encounter students damaging or taking property daily. 50% of teachers are dealing with students calling out and distracting others every lesson. And they're spending nearly an hour a day responding to the behaviours.
The Education Review Office came out with a report, and they called for national action on this. They said this is really, really serious. It said that violence and disruption had reached really critical levels, and half of teachers were spending an hour a day just responding to bad behaviour. And look, you asked before what was going on, what might be causing this, and that the Education Review Office said it did appear to be a combination of technology, as you said, that was a distraction, but also stresses on kids and that post-COVID effect, post the lockdowns of some students, struggling just to get on with one another. And while, there is obviously focus most on the worst behaviour, like assaults and so forth, but actually just talking inappropriately was the most common misbehaviour. Teachers said that was one of the biggest or most common problems, is that students would be talking and disrupting a lesson and so forth, and many of them saw that a lot.
And you touched on it earlier, some of the consequences for other students, how this might be impacting their learning and stuff. But what are the consequences for teachers? What kind of effect has this disruptive behaviour had on them?
Well, you certainly see in the survey results from the Council for Educational Research, and also some of the comments that were made in that Education Review Office report that was published back in 2024, that teachers were getting fed up. They were finding it very hard just to do their job, and it was, in a few cases, that made them feel unsafe. So definitely a very negative impact for the teachers, but this is their working environment, and for many of them it wasn't pleasant.
What have teachers up until this point been able to do to try and counteract some of this bad behaviour?
As well as, you've got all these surveys of that the Council of Education Research does. One of the things they did, they looked at, well, what helps in terms of school culture and so forth, what helps with behaviour. And they did find that teachers who got specific training in how to deal with poor behaviour, but also specific training in students' cultural diversity, and they felt that they were in a inclusive school culture, they were actually a lot better able to deal with student behaviour, and in many cases headed off at the pass. So it wasn't necessarily just about cracking down on kids and ruling them with an iron thumb. It was much more about creating a welcoming environment where kids were welcome, and you could see if students were stressed or not coping, you would head that off at the pass rather than leaving the students to lose it or just continue being disruptive.
Disruptive behaviour, is this something that schools need to be dealing with, or is this something that the government might actually need to step in and help do something about it?
Yeah, I know when I talk to schools and principals and school counsellors about it, there does seem to be an unmet need, or a growing need, I should say, for more assistance with student behaviour, and there have been repeated calls for that. And I guess that's a government role to provide the funding for that. And they have provided more funding for teacher aides and so forth, but it does seem that there always is more that's required or wanted.
Because how are schools dealing with disruptive behaviour now? I mean, you had a report, more than 10,000 children were stood down for physical assault on other students and teachers. That was your reporting last year. Is that what they have to resort to now? Because, a lot of the things that I've been seeing in these other reports as well is that stand downs should be the last, line of defence when it comes to bad behaviour in schools. So is that just what schools are just having to do now, is just stand them down?
The number of assaults has gone up. That figure you cited is something like nearly 10,000 kids stood down for assaulting other kids. There was another 1,100 kids stood down for assaulting teachers in 2024. But what happened in that year was there a really big increase in student numbers, so you would expect if there's more students overall, there's also going to be more of those sort of transgressions. So the thing to look at, I guess, is the stand-down rate. How many stand-downs were there per 1,000? And in 2024, it was 37 stand-downs per 1,000 students. Pretty high. So, yeah, schools are definitely turning to those sort of measures to try and deal with some of these kids.
John Gerritsen says one of the solutions to the problem is having lifelong consequences, and not in a good way.
I mean, one of the things that you do hear about, and I will get emails about this occasionally, is, we talk there about stand-down figures and so forth. There are also situations where kids are sort of encouraged to leave school, where their behaviour has been so poor or so difficult, the school kind of nudges them out. And, so that won't appear in your stand-down or expulsion or exclusion figures, but there's that going on as well. And also, as an aside, I was talking to someone who works with some really difficult young people the other day, and she was very much of the view that schools are kicking kids out too early over too little. That actually some schools, if we're saying there's problems with behaviour, some schools are way too intolerant of student behaviour.
It seems really discouraging for students who, yes, are showing, these bad behaviours, but are kind of being pushed towards the door of you should just maybe leave school. I mean, we've seen over the last few weeks, these figures of students leaving high school without any qualifications. This seems like it's a big issue.
Yeah, we've got record numbers of young people leaving school with no qualifications. Certainly, and if you look at the last sort of 20 years of records, it's running at sort of around 19%. So it's nearly 1 in 5. So I talked to a detail recently, and we were talking about 15% of kids leaving schools without qualifications. But actually, the ministry's been counting kids with part of a level 2 or level 3 qualification as having the equivalent of level 1. But so if you actually look at who's got a certificate, it's much higher. It's around 19%. And I think, that's definitely ringing alarm bells for some people.
But ACT has come up with a plan to deal with disruptive kids. As part of its election promise, the party says it will give teachers the clear legal power to remove seriously or persistently disruptive students and send them to a supervised space. It says that teachers will be protected when they use what is called reasonable and proportionate intervention to prevent harm or destruction of property. It proposes fines for parents and firmer consequences for assaulting staff or other students. But the PPTA's president, Chris Abercrombie, says the policy is misguided.
So they're referring mostly to an Euro report about this, and the vast majority of teachers that said there was disruption in the class was students talking when they shouldn't have been. And so you've got that level of disruption, and all the way to, quite serious disruption in the class. And I've had to deal with these once or twice over my 20-year career. At not one point did I think, hey, what will solve this? Me physically manhandling this child out of the classroom. Not one point did I go, this will make the situation better. Me laying my hands on a child to drag them out of a class. And so the policy's just, to be frank, it's stupid, and it doesn't solve the issue, and actually going to create way more issues than it will ever solve. But also, teachers already have the ability to physically restrain students, the legal authority to do it. And so if they're going to hurt themselves or others. And so I'm really struggling with this policy. It's a stupid policy designed by people who I don't think have spoken to a teacher at all about any of this.
Because is this something that teachers have been asking for?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, it completely came out of the blue. It's such a silly idea. I've removed the student, I've grabbed them, I've taken them out of the class. We're still going to need all those other supports. We're still going to need social workers and mental health and guidance counsellors and all of that. We're still going to need all of that we don't have right now. And so it's not going to solve a single problem. It's going to create more problems. No one's asking for it. No one wants it. I'm a real nuts and bolts sort of guy. I grew up in, say, Central Otago. I grew up on farms, a real practical nuts and bolts sort of guy. And I'm like, there's so many practical problems with this, let alone the philosophical discussion about should teachers do this. There's so many practical problems. What if I get injured? What if the student gets injured? What's the rest of the class doing? Is I'm manhandling this 17-year-old out of the class? Is everyone going to do this? I've got a friend who teaches at a all-boys school, and she said, I'm 1.60 m. What am I supposed to do? It's just ridiculous.
I think about this, especially for secondary, teachers. some of the students, as they get older, they do become stronger. And what would teachers do if they were trying to use reasonable force, I guess, to take a student out of the class, and then they do fight back?
Yeah, exactly. And also this phrase reasonable force. If I asked 100 people what reasonable force looked like, I'm sure I'd get 100 different answers. I'm a bloke in his 40s. What am I meant to drag a 14-year-old girl out of the class? Wrestle a 17-year-old boy out of the class? The practicalities of it are just ridiculous. And there is way better ways of dealing with a student who is refusing to leave the class or is disruptive like that. And it doesn't happen very often that a student refuses to leave the class, particularly in secondary. And I've only had it maybe twice in my 20-year career. And I dealt with it in a really, easy way, and it got resolved, and without anyone getting hurt, anyone putting hands on anyone or anything. So this is just dumb bumper sticker politics from a party that wanted to get some headlines.
Excuse my language when I say this, but I am quoting Paul Henry when he says,
There are a lot of little shits in classrooms.
Who are these little shits? Are they actually causing as much disruption as he's making it sound like?
No. And the fact that someone running for Parliament is calling the children of New Zealand that is a very odd decision to make, I think. And also, a lot of these students that do cause disruption have other things going on in their life. They may be neurodivergent, they may be not engaged in the lesson because of that. And there could be something simple. So I'll give an example again from my own teaching career. I had a quite disruptive student, not super disruptive, but wasn't really engaging in the lesson until we figured out he couldn't see the board because he needed glasses. He got glasses and then he started working and doing really well. And so if I had just sort of gone, disruptive student, out you go, where would that kid be today? A lot of these kids aren't getting their needs met for whatever reason, be it learning support, be it mental health, be it other things in their life. And just to sort of this idea that we just chuck them out of the class physically is just ludicrous, and calling them little shits is just ridiculous.
But as part of ACT's policy, they have used that error report that you had mentioned earlier, and it does state that our kids' behaviour in the classroom is some of the worst in the OECD, and that teachers lose 40 to 50 minutes a day responding to this challenging behaviour. This does seem like an issue, though. If this policy isn't the solution, then what are some?
We know that a lot of these students who are creating this disruption have specific learning needs. They have other things going on in their life, and we need to make sure that they are supported fully and resourced fully to meet those needs. And it could be something as simple as really making sure our alternative education system's working properly, that we're beefing up other Gateway, which is like a workplace training program, beefing up these other things so kids have options, schools have options to support these kids, be it learning support, be it mental health, be it alternative education, all of these things, and actually getting behind these young people and supporting them instead of calling them names and calling them disruptive and all of that. And it just, we need to get solutions and not just sort of, these cheap politics that seem to exist.
ACT's policy comes around the same time as a new report from Otago University that says autism spectrum disorder diagnoses have more than tripled over the past 15 years. Chris says that the increase is adding to the pressure on already stretched classrooms and highlights the need for more support.
Sometimes it's something as simple as a teacher aide in the classroom to support the learning. Sometimes it's a bit beyond that. So it's things like guidance counsellor support or specialist educational psychologist or speech language therapy or anything along those lines. So it can be something as simple as, or even adaptive technology in the class to make things a bit easier. So there's a huge range in that sort of that unmet need that we talk about.
And how long has that been an issue for?
It's been an issue for a while, but it's getting more pronounced. As we understand more about how brains work and we understand how our young people behave and act and how everything all interacts with each other, we're learning more and more, and we're sort of identifying things about that we need more support for that maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't have noticed or had the ability to understand.
But I guess, to play devil's advocate a little bit, I think part of it is we do need to raise, some of our students' achievement levels. But without having these students get left behind, what do you think some of those solutions could look like?
So what we need is needs-based funding. At the moment, we don't have needs-based funding. It's effectively, at the moment, a pot of money. And it doesn't matter how many students need that, that's the same amount of money. So once that pot runs dry, schools don't have the money to support those young people. And they start making, really hard decisions. Should we hire a teacher aide to support that young person, or should we have teacher PLD, or should we support school camp with that money? And so schools are making really horrible decisions about the spending of the resource because there's just not enough of it.
What usually gets cut first?
Unfortunately, often it's teacher aid time. The ops grant, that's the pot of money schools get, isn't enough to cover everything. At the moment, it's about 13% below inflation over the last several years. And so schools just don't have the resource for it. But also, we actually don't really understand the extent of the problem. We don't know exactly how many students have specific needs that need support. And at the moment, we've kind of just got stories from schools that principals inform us, but there's no data. And that's a big issue around sort of diagnosis. There's a thing called special assessment conditions, and that's for our assessments, so NZQA, our exams. About 10 years ago, they loosened the rules on that, so schools could decide if a student needed those special assessment conditions, and it's doubled the amount of students involved in that. And whereas beforehand, they had to have a specific diagnosis. So we know there's significant number of students who are undiagnosed, but the school knows they have a specific learning need.
So then does the government need to go out and do some research and figure out what the extent of that need is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we need a national needs assessment. This needs to be informed by teachers, by students, by whānau. There's bits of it. So there's the students at the highest need. These are the students who need one-on-one. That's called the OARS resource, ongoing resourcing. And those are the students at the highest need. We know that. That's really simple. We know exactly how many there are there. Beyond that, sort of what we call the unmet need, the missing middle, the students that don't qualify for that real high-level support but still need support, we don't really understand nationally how many there are, what the need is.
A lot of it, he says, boils down to the age-old funding argument, and it doesn't matter who's in government.
And this is across the political spectrum. We seem to want to have the world's best, cheapest education system. We spend about $8,000 less per secondary student than Australia. We spend $5,000 less per student than the UK. Finland spends double per student than what we do. Ireland spends $7,000 more per secondary student than we do. So these countries, and we spend well below, we're about $5,000 below what the OECD average is for secondary education spend per student. And so if we want the results of these other nations, and that's what the ACT Party talked about. You don't hear about disruption in Sweden and Norway and Finland and that. Well, they spend double what we spend.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to John Gerritsen and Chris Abercrombie. This episode was produced by Sharon Brett Kelly and engineered by Phil Benge. I'm Shalise Tansey, Mā te wā.